December 14, 1944, Puerto Princesa, Palawan Island, the Philippines. Late morning heat presses down on Camp 10A, the kind of heat that makes the corrugated roofing shimmer and the air taste like dust and aviation fuel. 150 American prisoners of war stand in loose formation near 3 long air raid shelters they dug themselves, trenches cut into the earth and roofed with logs and dirt, built at their captors' order for protection from the daily bombing runs overhead. For 2 years these men have cleared jungle, poured concrete, and laid the runway their guards now use to launch aircraft against their own countrymen. They have learned to read the moods of the men who guard them the way sailors read weather. Septutuanarito, the pace of a boot on gravel, the way a rifle is slung instead of carried, the difference between a guard who is bored and a guard who is watching. Today the guards are quiet in a way that feels wrong. No one says it aloud, but more than one man notices that the machine guns near the perimeter fence have shifted position since yesterday, angled now toward the camp rather than out toward the tree line. The morning work detail on the airfield runway finishes without incident. The men return to camp, eat what little the Japanese have allotted them, and settle in for another slow afternoon in the heat, unaware that the shelters they built with their own hands will, within the hour, become their graves or their only way out. Among the men in that camp is Private First Class Glenn McDowell, a young Marine who has survived nearly 3 years of captivity since the fall of Corregidor in the spring of 1942. He has already outlasted transport ships, starvation rations, and 2 years of forced labor building the very runway the Japanese now use against his own country's bombers. Beside him, closer to the second shelter, stands Marine Sergeant Rufus W. Smith, a career Marine known among the prisoners for his steadiness under pressure. The kind of man other prisoners quietly orient themselves around when something feels wrong. In a separate dugout reserved for the camp's few officers sit 4 men. Lieutenant Commander Henry Carlisle Knight of the Navy Dental Corps, Captain Fred Bruni, Lieutenant Carl Mango of the Army Medical Corps, and Warrant Officer Glenn C. Turner. These 4 are protected twice over Nitimhi Anaibanaitit. First by their status as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention that Japan signed in 1929 but rarely honored, and second by Mango's role as a medical officer, a role that under the laws of war marks him as someone who tends the wounded rather than fights. None of these men are armed. None of them have been formally charged with any offense. They are, by every standard their captors claim to recognize, non-combatants held for the duration of a war that both sides can see is ending. That protected status is the entire moral center of what happens next. No tatitu sitsit, men who cannot fight back, guarded by men who know exactly what the rules require of them, and who choose to break those rules anyway. Nearby, Marine Sergeant Douglas Bogue moves among the other prisoners with the same forced calm everyone has learned to project. 2 years of captivity have taught these men that panic gets noticed, and being noticed gets you beaten. So they move slowly, speak quietly, and watch the guards out of the corners of their eyes. It is a discipline that has kept most of them alive this long. It will not be enough today. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, an air raid siren sounds. It is not the first false alarm the camp has heard, and the prisoners move toward the shelters with the same tired obedience they have shown for months, filing down into the dark trenches shoulder to shoulder, waiting for an all-clear that has always come before. This time it does not come. This time, the guards do not take cover alongside them. This time they move to the mouths of the shelters, and Lieutenant Yoshikazu Sato, the camp commandant known privately among the prisoners as Buzzard, gives the order. Guards appear at the entrances carrying 5-gallon cans of gasoline and begin pouring it down into the packed trenches. For a moment, some of the men inside think it is only another cruelty, another indignity to endure and survive. Then someone strikes a match, and the shelters become furnaces within seconds. Fire moves through the confined space faster than the men inside can react, faster than they can think. Those nearest the entrances are shot or bayoneted as they try to climb out into daylight. Those who manage to push past the guards run for the perimeter fence, some of them already burning, and are cut down by machine gun and rifle fire before they reach the wire. Mango, his clothing on fire, runs not toward the fence but toward the Japanese line itself, arms raised, pleading for the shooting to stop. He is answered with a burst of machine gun fire and dies where he stands, still in the act of asking men who have already decided not to listen. Rufus Smith, near the entrance of his own shelter, sees guards firing into the neighboring trench and shouts a warning to the men still trapped inside. One of the first clear signals to reach the rest of the camp that this is not an accident, not a drill, and not going to stop. In the officer's dugout, the same gasoline is poured, the same fire set. Knight, Bruni, and Turner die alongside Mango within minutes of one another. 4 unarmed men who held no weapon and posed no threat, killed in the same fire meant for every prisoner in the camp. These are not panicked conscripts improvising under pressure. Sato and his men have run this camp for 2 years. They know precisely which men are unarmed, which are wounded, which wear the insignia of medical officers protected by international law. They know exactly what they are doing, and they do it anyway, methodically, shelter by shelter, until the killing is finished or the sun goes down, whichever comes first. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that don't get told in textbooks, the ones that survive only because a handful of men lived long enough to testify, that's what this channel exists to do. Stay with this one to the end. Word of what has happened at Camp 10A does not stay contained for long. Some of the men who escape the initial slaughter make it over the cliff at the edge of the camp and down to the rocky shoreline below, hiding among the rocks and mangroves through the night while guards continue to hunt the perimeter with flashlights and rifles. By dusk, 11 men have reached the water and begun swimming or wading along the coast, badly burned, some of them wounded, all of them alone. Filipino guerrilla fighters operating in the hills above Puerto Princesa begin picking up survivors within hours, moving them inland under cover of darkness, and passing word up their own chain of contacts that something has happened at the airfield camp. By the following morning, that word has reached American intelligence channels operating in the southern Philippines. Within days, fragments of the report reach higher headquarters. First as an unconfirmed rumor of a massacre, then as more survivors are recovered and debriefed, as a confirmed account with names, numbers, and a rough count of the dead. By the time General Douglas MacArthur's staff receive a formal summary, the figure being reported is that of the original 150 prisoners held at Camp 10A. Only 11 are known to be alive. The report reaches senior officers already exhausted by 2.5 years of documenting what Japanese forces have done to captured Americans across the Philippines. The death march from Bataan, the hell ships, the starvation camps. A staff officer reads the Palawan report once, sets it down, and reads it again before saying anything. When he does speak, his voice does not rise. "Get me everything we have on this camp, Commandant," he says. "Every name, every unit. I want this documented the way we'd want it documented if it were our own men writing it down." There is no shouting in the room, no dramatic gesture, only the quiet, deliberate tone of a man who understands that outrage will not bring back a single one of the dead. But a properly built record might, eventually, hold someone accountable. "We buried men on Bataan without knowing half their names," he tells an aide later that week. "We are not going to bury these men without knowing all of theirs." It is the kind of line that gets repeated afterward by the men who heard it, not because it is loud, but because it is exactly true. What follows is less a manhunt than a slow, methodical accounting. As American forces retake the southern Philippines through early 1945, investigators move into Puerto Princesa behind the advancing troops. On the 28th of February, the U.S. 8th Army lands on Palawan as part of Operation Victor III. By the 2nd of March, American forces control most of the island, hunting down scattered Japanese defenders with the help of Filipino guerrillas who have waited months for this chance to settle accounts of their own. Investigators locate the site of Camp 10A and begin the grim work of recovering remains from the burned shelters. 520 bones found huddled together where men had tried to escape the flames. In more than one case, with small conical holes dug into the earth by fingertips where prisoners had tried, in their final minutes, to dig their way to freedom through the dirt at the base of the trench walls. Each set of remains is catalogued, cross-referenced against camp rosters, and, where possible, identified by dog tags, dental records, or personal effects recovered alongside them. It is slow, unglamorous work, clipboards and evidence tags rather than dramatic confrontation. But it is the mechanism by which 11 survivors' testimony becomes a legal case rather than a rumor that fades with time. The paperwork trail matters as much as the physical recovery. Investigators compile rosters of every guard and officer known to have served at Camp 10A, cross-referencing unit records against surviving Japanese documentation wherever it can be located. Names are flagged. Units are traced through the chaos of a collapsing defense across the Philippine archipelago. A diary later recovered from a Japanese soldier stationed near the camp is entered into the growing case file. A short, almost bureaucratic entry noting that 150 prisoners of war were executed on the 14th of December, followed weeks later by an entry describing the repair shop where those same men once worked as now a lonely place. It is the kind of evidence investigators prize most, not a confession, but an unguarded admission, written by someone who had no reason to lie to his own diary. Investigators also begin tracking the whereabouts of the guards and officers who ran the camp, aware that many of the men responsible may already be dead in the fighting still raging across the islands, and that the record they are building may be the only justice some of the dead will ever receive. That suspicion proves largely correct. Lieutenant Sato, the camp commandant who gave the order to burn the shelters, is never captured. He is believed to have been killed defending Palawan in the weeks after the massacre, along with several of the officers directly responsible for planning it. Men who will never sit before a judge or answer for what they ordered. But not everyone escapes accountability through death in battle. In August of 1948, nearly 4 years after the fire, a war crimes tribunal convenes in Yokohama, Japan, to try the 16 Japanese soldiers connected to the Palawan Massacre who can still be found and identified. Several of the American survivors, men who once hid burned and bleeding among coastal rocks, listening to guards search for them by flashlight, travel back across the Pacific to sit in a courtroom and testify against their former captors, face to face. For the first time since the war ended, there is no physical confrontation in that courtroom, and none is needed. The power in the room belongs entirely to the record being built, sentence by sentence, question by question. Under questioning, one former guard, Superior Private Sawa, admits under oath that 7 or 8 prisoners of war came running out of one of the burning shelters during the massacre, confirming in his own words the very killing his defense attorneys are trying to minimize. Marine Sergeant Douglas Bogue, one of the 11 survivors, sits across from the men who once guarded him and answers every question calmly, refusing to let the proceedings become theater, refusing to give the tribunal anything but exactly what happened. There is no shouting from the survivors either, only testimony, repeated as plainly as they can manage, entered permanently into a record that cannot be burned or buried a second time. I never like to see anybody suffer, one guard tells the tribunal, trying to explain his own actions that day. The tribunal is not interested in explanations. It is interested in what happened, in order, with names attached, and it says so plainly before handing down its verdicts. Of the 16 Japanese soldiers eventually brought before that tribunal, 6 are acquitted, and 10 receive prison sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years. A resolution that leaves many of the survivors feeling the reckoning fell short of what 139 dead men deserved. Separately, the broader question of command responsibility for atrocities across the Philippine campaign is folded into the prosecution of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the senior Japanese commander in the region, whose trial becomes one of the defining legal cases of the post-war era, precisely because the Palawan Massacre is cited as evidence of what happened under his command structure, whether or not he personally knew of it in advance. Yamashita is convicted and executed in 1946, a verdict that remains debated by legal historians to this day for what it says about how far up a chain of command responsibility can be made to reach. All 10 of the men convicted at Yokohama are ultimately released under a general amnesty in 1958, a fact the survivors who testified against them would carry for the rest of their lives. What outlasts the trials, in the end, is not the length of any sentence but the names. In 1952, the recovered remains of 123 victims of the Palawan Massacre are interred together at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery near St. Louis, Missouri, laid to rest under a shared memorial after years spent as unidentified bone fragments recovered from a burned trench on the other side of the world. For families who had waited nearly a decade for any word of what happened to a son, a husband, or a brother listed only as missing, that burial is the first solid ground they are given to stand on, a place to send a letter, a date to mark, a name carved into stone rather than a blank space on a telegram. Some of those families never learn more than the bare outline the Army is able to provide. Others, decades later, seek out survivors like McDowell and Bogue simply to hear, in a stranger's voice, some small detail of how their relative had lived in that camp before the 14th of December. A joke he told, a habit he had, anything beyond the fact of his death. Glenn McDowell, one of the 11 who survived, goes home and spends the next 29 years as an Iowa highway patrolman and later a county sheriff, carrying the story of Camp 10A quietly for decades before it is finally recorded at length for history. He is later called up again during the Korean War, serving a year at Camp Pendleton before finally hanging up his Marine uniform for good. Rufus Smith, Douglas Bogue, and the other survivors scatter back into ordinary American life. Fritz made a Fritz, a patrolman, a laborer, a husband, a father, each of them a walking piece of evidence for what 139 other men never got the chance to become. None of them asked to be called heroes for having lived. Most of them, when asked, simply say they were lucky, and that the men who didn't make it out of those shelters deserved to be the ones remembered. The men of Camp 10A were unarmed. They were prisoners. They had been promised, at least on paper, the protection of international law that both sides had signed and one side chose to ignore. That protection failed them completely, in the space of a single afternoon, on a strip of jungle airfield most Americans have still never heard of. But the record of what happened to them did not fail, because 11 men lived long enough and stayed steady enough under oath years later to make sure it couldn't be erased or explained away. If this channel exists for one reason, it's this one. These stories only survive because someone chooses to keep telling them accurately, without embellishment, long after the people who lived them are gone. If you want more of this kind of history, documented, sourced, and told the way the people who were there deserve, stay close. There are more of these stories left to tell,